Today in Empowering Workplaces, I am thrilled to welcome Aoife O'Brien. Aoife is the founder of Happier Work and host of the award-winning Happier Work podcast. She is the author of the recently released book, Thriving Talent, which we will talk about in today's podcast. I'm so glad you're here for this powerful conversation. Welcome to Empowering Workplaces, the podcast where we explore how to create more meaningful, fulfilling, and productive work environments. I'm Sanja, an organizational psychologist, and we'll be talking with leaders, experts, and innovators who are shaping the future of work and sharing their stories on how we can all contribute to building a workplace where everyone can thrive. Whether you're an HR professional, a leader, or just someone who cares about making work better, I'm glad you're here. Aoife, welcome to Empowering Workplaces. I am so incredibly excited to welcome you back as a guest, especially as your wonderful, amazing book hits publication. Now, you and I have been friends for a long time. I feel like I know everything about you, but in case some of our listeners are getting to know you for the first time, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about yourself and in particularly what drove you to write the book now.
Yes, yeah. Maybe let's start with the book piece because it's something I always have wanted to do since a very young age. I've always wanted to write a book. And for a long time, I thought that book was going to be a novel. And over time, so I've had a 20-year corporate career when I was still working for an employer. I worked in market research in fast-moving consumer goods, or it's called consumer packaged goods in the US, CPG, doing market research. So analyzing data, turning insights into stories and solving problems for big global organizations. And it really ticked the boxes on my personal strengths. I really found workplaces I really thrived in or really enjoyed. But I had a couple of experiences that were not so favorable. And it started making me question what all this work stuff is about. So I guess I was spoiled in my early career, having worked in fantastic organizations with really positive cultures. And again, probably wouldn't have known even the words to describe that at the time. Now I have the vocabulary. And like I said, those couple of experiences caused me to call into question what this is all about. And I questioned myself and, is it me? How could I have made this decision? What should HR be doing? What should leaders be doing in this situation to create, the kind of environment where people can actually succeed? And because of all of that, I left both of those, two separate organizations in the span of probably about 5 years. And I went on and I did a master's in organizational behavior where I asked all of those difficult questions and started finding some answers to that. And I always was looking at it from the perspective of an organization, because when we lose people from an organization, it costs money in training, in hiring, in recruitment fees, in the ramp up time, in the lost time that managers and HR have to take out of their days to try and find people and train them and all of the rest. And also from an individual perspective, trying to understand, how do I really reach my full potential at work? And so this book is the culmination of the research I did for my master's, the work that I do all the time with clients, and the conversations I have on my own podcast. And it's really focusing on the leaders and how to create the conditions where people can really thrive at work. It's the kind of book that I wish I had. And it's the kind of book I wish my leaders had to be able to understand a little bit more about me and how different people approach the workplace, essentially. And someone described it recently as an encyclopedia. I took a little bit of offense to that because I was like, an encyclopedia. But I think she meant it in a very positive way, in that if you have an issue at work, it's very highly likely that it's covered somewhere in this book. And the framework that I refer to in the book is broad, but I get very specific within each of the elements. So it's wide ranging, but very specific within those parameters.
Yeah. And I love when you first started describing and telling us a little bit more about yourself. One of the things you said, you thought you would write a novel, and that actually really resonated with me, because as I was reading the book, you did such an incredible job of combining personal stories that are so relatable. Because really, I mean, if somebody's listening to this podcast and they've had an amazing work experience their entire life, I applaud you. Like that's lovely. It's just not most people's experience, unfortunately. Yeah. And so I found myself, as I was reading it, that I could really relate to a lot of the situations you were describing. But then also, as a researcher, as a scientist myself, you brought in such a wealth of information to support your passion and to support your viewpoints and to support those stories where you were saying, it's a shame that I needed to experience this, but I'm also here to help people and organizations do better in the future. And exactly. So I thought, now when you were mentioning the novel, it was like, I saw that in there. And I think especially, especially in a book that tackles such important subjects, it makes it again very real and very relatable. So I'm so glad you did it. I know the books are a huge undertaking. My only so-called book was a dissertation many moons ago, and that was yeah. So anytime I have brilliant authors on like yourself, all the appreciation to the work that you do and really putting that passion and brilliance on paper. So
I think on that note, like one of the things I found doing the master's is there's a wealth of information available out there. There are so many fantastic studies and pieces of research that are being done, and they're being shared in academic journals, but leaders are not necessarily getting access to them, whether it's the academic jargon that's being used, it's the overly detailed methodologies. But how do we give leaders something that they can actually take and implement and run with, because they know that it's solid evidence, and they know, practically speaking, how to apply that in their own workplace?
Oh, absolutely. Maybe ironically enough, actually, before reading your book, I just reread Amy Edmondson's book, and that was all about psychological safety. And that's somebody who you mention quite often in your writing. And one of the things that I was thinking about is, there are times that maybe we need to hear the same kind of message and similar information, but in different ways, because it'll resonate with us either the way that it was articulated or because it found us at a point in our life where it's really impactful. And that's so I think
point. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Thank you. So I think in your writing that really struck me, because you and I are in the same field. And so again, we'll talk about psychological safety in a minute. To me, it's something that obviously both Amy Edmondson and other researchers, practitioners have been talking about for a while. But now as the rise of AI and all the madness that's happening in the workplace, I feel like it's having this resurgence of being more relevant. Not that it ever wasn't, but I'm wondering if maybe even people and organizations that were not spending as much attention on it in, for example, reading your book, that's something that's going to resonate because of the time that we're living in today. So I loved all the different things that you pulled in. So speaking of psychological safety, and as I mentioned, it's something that is, very top of mind for me. And I'm guessing based on, who listens to this podcast, for a lot of the listeners who are tuning in the organization. So you position psychological safety as the absolute foundation of your thriving talent framework. Why do you think this is the case? And what can leaders do to make sure their teams feel they're in a psychologically safe environment?
Yeah. So I suppose just to paint the picture of the model, the foundation, if you picture it, for anyone who's not watching on video, for anyone who's listening in, picture it like this. At the base is psychological safety, and that's the foundation of the model. Then we have 3 pillars. Pillars are workplace culture, drivers, and capabilities. And then we have a capstone, or a top of the temple, which is leadership. And so for me, psychological safety is at the foundation, because without psychological safety, we can't execute across the 3 pillars. So without psychological safety, we can't create a positive workplace culture, because people can't get called out on their behaviors that are not being tolerated. It's not a safe place to actually do that. People can't openly talk about what their needs and where their needs are not being met. And it's also really important for capabilities to understand what people's strengths are and to be able to create the space for them to fail and to try new things, to push the edges, to grow in their own capabilities. So that's why it's so important as the foundation. I think we really need to have it in place. And then equally important on kind of the top side is having leaders, having strong leaders in place to be able to execute across those three as well. In terms of how to create psychological safety, like for me, and this is from a conversation as well with Amy Edmondson, she said that the default basically is not psychologically safe environment. So we mostly think we have created a safe environment when in fact it's maybe comfortable or, you know, it's not safe. People don't feel safe to speak up. And I think we can have different feelings of safety at different levels as well. So if you think about the level that you're at, and if you're in a meeting with your peers, for example, maybe you feel safe to speak up there. But if you go back to your team who are on a different level to you may not feel safe to share with you what's going on. So I think we need to be aware of that as leaders, that how we feel when we're with our peers may be different to how our team feels when they're with us, and we need to create that. So in the book, I talk about the 4 C's. So I talk about clarity, first of all, and that's being really clear on our values, really clear on setting expectations. That's something I'm quite passionate about as well, is clarity around what's expected and equally what's not expected in the workplace. I also talk about curiosity. Curiosity is one of my values, but it's coming at things with a learning mindset. And, you know, it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay not to have all the answers. And I think as leaders, sometimes we put pressure on ourselves to have all of the answers, when that should not be the expectation. We should be the ones creating the conditions, but not necessarily the ones with all the answers. I also talk about care, and this again has come up a lot on the podcast, is showing people you care. And I refer specifically in that section to Kim Scott's model around radical candor, although I think she's changed it recently to compassionate candor. So it's showing people that you care so that you can tell them what's really going on. So you show people that you care so that you can actually challenge them directly about their behavior, about their performance, about their ideas, whatever it might be. But you have to show people that you care. And then the final one is consistency. And then that's really about showing up in a consistent way. It's not showing up one day and you're all open to ideas and you're challenging people, and then the next day your behavior is not the same. It's about maintaining that kind of consistent behavior so people know what to expect from you, that it is a consistent experience across the behaviors that you're demonstrating.
Yeah. Well, thank you for those examples. I think they're very practical, and I think it's something people can wrap their heads around, and something that is important to do self-reflection on and also get people's input, because to your point, we all have a perception of the world that's our own. And a lot of times we tend to maybe even project that on our colleagues and our team when maybe their experiences are different. And so having those conversations, understanding, and I think also what you were saying about psychological safety and maybe going into it, even assuming you don't really have it or your team doesn't have it, is a good thing to know that you're not the only one, because oftentimes people might be a little worried and say, well, gosh, like if my team doesn't have psychological safety, does that make me a terrible leader? Like surely every good leader, team should have psychological safety, but there are so many different inputs that I think if we go in thinking that oftentimes that's maybe the norm, but it is something that can be changed, it makes us more proactive versus not wanting to maybe ask about it, because then we'd be on the defensive and say, but I'll look really bad, like if my team doesn't have that. And usually it's the leaders who care that are going to do that kind of work, not the authoritarian leaders or people that, rule by fear. They probably won't ask much about psychological safety, but the ones who do care might be the ones that are worried, like, oh no, like what if I'm failing my team? What do I do? Like, am I ready to really do something about it? So we talked a lot about, leaders, managers, teams, and I do think with, sadly, so many layoffs happening these days globally and team structure changing, that in many cases, people are going to have to manage even bigger amounts of teams. Maybe people who have never been in management positions are going to have to manage for the first time. And so in your book, you discuss the Peter principle and how many new managers are what you call accidental managers. And so I have always argued that many organizations ask too much of their managers without always giving them the necessary resources and training to be successful. And so, with the rise of AI and additional pressures on managers to make it work for themselves and their teams, I'm really becoming even more nervous about the expectations in place on managers. I think for the last several years, at least, they've been somewhat unrealistic, and now we just keep piling things on. And so if the main job of a people manager is to develop their people, what is the most critical skill leaders lack today in your research, and how does your framework help them develop it?
Yeah. So for me, and I talk about this in the leadership section on the book. When I first wrote that chapter, I just went all in. I was like talking about leading other people, but actually I took a step back and I thought, wait a minute, before we even think about leading others, we need to think about leading ourselves and how we're leading ourselves. And I start by talking about this idea of self-awareness. And I have recently read Tasha Eurich's book, Insight. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend. It's all about gaining insight into ourselves and the different types of self-awareness and how we can be externally self-aware, so understand the impact that we have on others, or we can be kind of internally self-aware, and maybe we're not both at the same time. And so understanding the difference and the nuances. And I think for me, it's important to understand ourselves so that we can manage ourselves, so that we understand what can be triggering for us, what can be uncomfortable, what's causing an emotional reaction in us. Because I think a lot of those, let's say, negative leadership behaviors come from that reactivity or come from time pressure. So understanding the context in which we operate and knowing how we're showing up, the impact it's having on us and what's going on internally for us, but also how we are showing up and the impact that how we show up has on the other people around us. So, we can think about, I'm trying to think of an example here, but really understanding if I'm really stressed, like, so today I think I've had 6 calls, not all back to back. I've had space in between them, but it still means I don't have a good run of time to do some proper deep work. And I'm just doing itty bitty things. Today, if I was in a corporate environment, it could be one of those days where I'm really stressed because I feel like I'm not really getting anything done. I'm having meetings and I'm talking about work, but I'm not moving things forward. And so it could be the day that if someone asks me for something, I can just respond in a or react in a way that I don't want to react because I'm feeling under pressure. And I think if we can acknowledge that and take responsibility for that, it goes a long way to creating those better relationships at work. So that would be my key thing, is growing in self-awareness. And again, from Tasha's book, she talks about how so many of us believe that we're self-aware, and I include myself in this as well. We believe that we're self-aware, but how self-aware are we actually? Do we understand the impact that we're having on others? And do we understand what's going on for us internally when external things happen to us as well?
Yeah, I'm so glad you bring that up. And I can't remember what the statistic is, but I was talking to another friend about that recently, and it was something wild. I want to say like 7%. Don't quote me on it, but around that of people who are actually self-aware. And again,
yeah, I think it is something crazy like that. Yeah,
what? And then because you would say, I don't know, like, oh, if you think about if a person is reflecting, are they self-aware? Like, yeah, I would say it. But then I would say yes. But then when you hear that statistic, it in a way opens up the opportunity, like, well, wait a minute, am I like really one of the 7%? Like now I'm starting to, maybe open up to the possibility a little more that I'm not one of those. And I remember this happened to me. It was unfortunately with a friend and a college roommate many moons ago, but we were in some situation. And I remember I was really offended by something she did or said, and I felt so wronged. And she said to me, she's like, Sanja, but do you realize how this makes me feel? Or do you realize how you make me feel? And I was so shocked because I didn't at all.
Yeah.
Like not even the slight. It wasn't like, oh, I knew this made her upset, but I didn't know the volume it made her upset. Like completely unaware that anything that I was doing was having an impact on her, and it was having this profound impact on her. And so, I mean, again, that was, decades ago, but I think for people to remember that, and I think that's also tough because a lot of times in worst case scenarios, we don't realize it and we don't mean it. We don't want something that we're doing, and maybe we have
the intention. Yeah.
No. But just because you have good intentions doesn't mean it's not causing some kind of a negative ripple effect. So I love that you talk about that, because I do think that there's that kind of work might not be, I mean, it's a little bit of, I don't want to say it's easy, because it's not easy to open up yourself to feedback from others. And it's also not easy oftentimes for others to be candid with you. To tell you the information.
Yeah.
But it's so important to happen because it does have such a huge impact on us. So I wanted to maybe not pivot, I guess it's kind of related, talk a little bit about well-being, because this is one area that I'm so incredibly passionate about, but it's kind of tricky because I think when I first started working, I feel like the hustle culture was like alive and well, like getting as little sleep as possible, functioning on as little sleep as possible, like how many cups of coffee could you possibly handle in a day? Like all of that was badge of honor. And I do think that that's changing, but sometimes I feel like it's not changing maybe as quickly as I'd hoped, or maybe people are becoming a little more vocal. We're still not really into well-being, but a little more like just work yourself into the ground and that's okay. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, in the work that you've been doing, what is the most convincing evidence or pieces of evidence that you would suggest to maybe present to somebody that has a little bit more of that, what I at least call old school thinking? Maybe they wouldn't say that, but that the mentality of pushing and burning out, for the leaders to see that this kind of perpetual busyness that you talk about likely leads to burnout, and what are some effective ways to get things done without such high risk of burnout? I think we need to continue to have this conversation, to keep giving people information and try to keep convincing that it's not that having well-being is not like mutually exclusive with being successful in business. That you can actually be healthy and of a stable mind and happy and also successful in business.
I think I grew up in that period as well, Sanja, where busyness was a badge of honor, and the busier you are, the more successful you are perceived to be, and the more meetings you get invited to. So I still sometimes have that mentality, and I still have that remnants of, I just need to push on through. I don't need any rest. I don't need to look after myself. This is a busy time and it's going to end soon. So I think it's important to acknowledge that sometimes we can be our own worst enemies, that it's not coming from someone else, that this inner drive, for me at least, to do that. And I think if you want to convince, and I'm happy to call them, the old school style of leadership where it's command and control, and the expectation is around performance and productivity and busyness at all costs. I think one of the biggest things that I see is the law of diminishing returns. So it's a law that we can take from economics, but the same thing applies here. So if you're working more than 40, I don't know what the exact statistics are, but like, let's say you're going over 50, 60 hours a week, each additional hour that you work in that time is not going to produce the kinds of returns that you would get for the earlier kind of productive hours that you have. When I looked at productivity specifically in the book, I was looking at it because a lot of people just talk about it as it's the number of hours that you're working, that's how productive you are. But really, it's the ratio between the outputs or the outcomes that you produce and the amount of time that you're working. So if you're working longer hours and actually the outcomes that you're producing are not as good as the original outcomes, then that's one reason. And I think the other big thing here is the expense that it causes in a company. So you can look at it from a few different ways. There's the sickness. So if you're burning out or if you're chronically stressed, you're more likely to take a sick day, which is going to cost the company in productivity over time. If you properly burn out and you end up in hospital, thankfully that has never happened to me. But if you're out of work for 2 weeks, that's going to cost the company money. And if you're working in that kind of environment and you see an option or you find an opportunity and you leave, then that's going to cost the company money as well. And I think when you're talking with these people, to me, it's bringing it back down to money, because that's what they're looking for ultimately, is the profit. And if you can show how creating a sustainable environment where people are successful and they're well at the same time, and it leads to a greater level of profitability, I think that's the best way that we can do that. I think another important nuance here, and this could be my next book, I'm not sure, but it's something I found particularly interesting and I'm seeing more and more, especially in the day of AI, is understanding the impact that we're having. So with AI, we need to be more discerning as leaders. We need to prioritize more. We need to be a bit closer to actually making decisions on things that are going to move the needle, rather than getting caught up in busy work just because that's what we've always done. I think we can utilize technology a little bit more effectively to do the stuff that technology is designed to do, and spend a bit more time on the human things, whether that's building relationships, whether it is doing the things that we're uniquely capable of doing, exercising judgment, all of that kind of thing, I think is really important as well.
Yeah. Well, and that's a really interesting argument, and something I'll try to keep as concise as possible because I have so many opinions. So in several recent conversations about AI, I've had debates or even listened to people debate what happens with the extra time that AI creates. And I've had people argue, if you in your job found yourself having to do so much work and at the risk of burnout or had burned out at some point, you can take that time back and, spend it on yourself. And then I've had other sides of the argument that's like, but wait a minute, no, that's company time. Like, you're not taking away company time to spend it on yourself. Now you could be, like, were you doing 40 hours a week, 30, like all of that I think will become very interesting in the future. Like, how do we repurpose that efficiency that AI gives us? And I hope we do find arguments in data, like you were saying. And another one big hope of mine is, so you were mentioning you, like me, kind of, lived and started your career in that mentality of just really, in a way, working yourself to the ground. And I think we, like, are probably similar-ish age enough. So I'll group us together.
Gen X, like, let's call us Gen.
I still try to hang out to Gen Y. Sometimes my colleagues laugh at me, depending, on what calendar you look at. But I'm also starting to see like some very real physical and mental changes in myself. And yes. I very much realize, right? Like, thank you for that. Like, for not making me feel alone.
Oh,
like,
no.
Wow, like,
it's just you.
Tired, yeah, I know. Like, oh, Sanja, I don't know what you're talking about. Not me. Yeah. Like, I find myself with a lot less patience, and I find myself more forgetful, and so I'm also hoping that maybe for those of us who have like the remnants when this was all a norm, when we see some of these things really impacting us also personally, because to me, I think that's one of the biggest shames, is a lot of times true change happens when you personally feel the impact of something. Like, for a lot of people, like, data works and all of that, but when you start to realize, wait a minute, I worked a lot of hours this week, but now all of a sudden I send an email to the wrong person, or I put the wrong data point in the document, or I did something like, or I was really terrible to my family because I was so tired, and now I'm like fighting with my kids. I'm fighting like with my significant other, like that. All those kinds of things I think also are really big drivers of change when you start to realize that it's not just other people being whiny babies. This is real, and it's also happening to me. So fingers crossed for the future. I think there's still a lot, work to do, but I always, whenever I can, with people like yourself, I throw these, things in the conversation, because I feel like the more we know, the better we're equipped to make an argument, the more likely we will. So next, I wanted to talk about vulnerability.
Yeah.
That is, I applaud Brene Brown. She has probably been the most influential person in driving the importance of vulnerability in leadership. Yet, there is a line between vulnerability and oversharing. And I would say, quite frankly, sometimes I'm personally worried about which line of I stand on. And if you ask my team, maybe they're worried too. I don't know. So you discussed the line between productive vulnerability and draining oversharing. So for a leader who wants to be authentic, what is a safe way to show vulnerability to their team without making employees feel that they need to take on the leader's emotional burden?
Yeah, I think so. When I hear that question, I think of a leader that I had in the past. It's probably not quite 20 years, but maybe close enough to 20 years ago. And she was my boss at the time. And we were under quite a bit of pressure she was working on a client presentation. And she just completely broke down with me. And basically, from my perspective, I felt she was, again, wouldn't have had the language at the time. But when I look back now, she was completely offloading her emotional load onto me and looking for support from me. So I suppose the difference between completely breaking down and saying, I can't do this, I can't cope anymore, versus recognizing in yourself, something's going on here. This is what I'm feeling. This is what's going on for me. And I need to get some support, is very different to just completely emotionally breaking down. And I suppose it's where does the burden lie? And what are you looking for from someone else? Are you looking for them to kind of pick you up emotionally, or are you looking to vent, or are you looking to model what vulnerability actually looks like and show them, and I think we should be modeling vulnerability and showing that we don't have all the answers and we're not expected to have all the answers. And I think that's kind of a core difference. Like, that was a really personal experience for me. And it's one that really sticks in my mind, where I think she just crossed the line a little bit too much by just completely breaking down and saying, I have no idea what I'm doing. It was kind of like, I'm in over my head. I'm working too many hours and I don't know how to solve this. I'm telling you this so you can solve it for me. Opposed to, that's kind of like, when I look back, that's, I think, maybe not that she was deliberately doing that, but it was kind of, if I was like, I'm not really sure what to do. I'm the person who looks up to you for this kind of advice. And now I see you completely breaking down. So I think it is maybe a fine line. Like, I think it's okay to show that, but I think we need to be really careful in how we show up and how we show that. So it's not overburdening someone else with what's going on for us.
Yeah. You're totally right. And I'm trying to think of it from so many different angles, and trying to think of, now more and more we're talking about showing up to work as your full self and your authentic self. And what does that really mean? And is there too much of it? And I think that balance is important. And maybe it's not the same relationship with everyone. Maybe it's just understanding what is it that you're looking for, and what are the outlets that you need. Because now I've, in my career, in my life, lived on 3 different continents. And the way, for example, even mental health is socialized and therapy, like outside of work, is very different. Like right now in Argentina, I think there's a 1-to-1 ratio of therapists to people, and almost everybody goes to therapy. Yeah, I don't know. It was really wild, and really, in a really positive way. And I remember, I probably said this so many times, like when I first moved to Argentina, I remember talking to somebody and saying, oh, would you like to grab a cup of coffee? You know, maybe we can go at like 7 o'clock. And they say, you know what, my therapy session ends at 7. So maybe could we do it at 7:30? And I thought, how
Wow, so
great is
open.
that, right?
Yeah,
Because I was living in
Yeah.
London before. I was living in the US for 20 years. And unless you knew somebody really well, you usually wouldn't bring that up. And this person I was just getting to know. And I thought, wow, how wonderful that that's normalized. And now we think about, you know, all the different coaches, up and coming AI coaches, like these different outlets where we can have those conversations. I think to me, one of the things that it's at least personally served me well is, again, saying when I don't know things, saying when I'm,
yes,
this is my opinion, but I want to open up, or when I have things going on in my private life, that's where I was kind of, you know, joking, but serious, is like, where's that fine line? Like, I remember when Matteo was a newborn, I think my team knew every time I didn't get any sleep, or any time Matteo was sick, or because I would walk into a meeting and it's like, hey, how is everyone? I'm like, I'm good, except like little edgy today, didn't sleep very much. And this is what's going on.
I think
and this
that's
is trying to figure out.
Yeah. I think that's good for managing expectations and for being open with people and saying, you know, and even kids aside, like I didn't have a great sleep last night, so I might be a bit more on edge today. So just kind of warning people in advance on the authenticity thing. So, and again, I've had this conversation on the podcast, and in the book I've drawn upon the podcast conversation, but also Dr. Tomas Chamorro Premusic, his work on this idea of authenticity. And it's about showing up as our professional selves, not because I think sometimes it's weaponized a little bit where we say, I'm just being myself, I'm just sharing my opinion. And that's not what we want authenticity to be. And in the example shared on my podcast, Sheila Walsh talks about, like, you don't speak to your colleagues the way that you might speak to your siblings or your family. It's a different kind of dynamic. It's a different kind of relationship. And so it's about showing up as our professional selves at work, not showing as, you know, not just using authenticity as to be a blanket. I can just be who I am or who I want to be. And call
it's not a permission to be a jerk, right? Like, I think that's the biggest.
That's exactly what I'm trying to say.
Well, you want me to be authentic, and I'm, you know, an A word.
I'm actually normally a jerk.
So like, no, maybe reel that in. Maybe, you know, like, show us some of your opinions, but it's not a like an excuse to.
It's not a free for all.
No, but I would probably say for our listeners, because I kind of know and have an idea of who will be listening to a podcast called Empowering Workplaces, is that if somebody is on the fence, probably they're not at a huge risk of oversharing and their vulnerability. And thank you for your feedback for me too, because what I was mentioning, like when I talk about, you know, family things, or when I talk about some things that are, you know, maybe not even family related, but just challenges that impact work, because everything's, you know, blended. Then it sounds like I'm still staying in the lane pretty good. So I'm glad. I will give my team permission. They're like, whoa, Sanja, pull it back. Like, we don't need to know about this. Like, keep it at home. So I have one more question before we start to wrap. I have a million more, but I'm glad that I'm your friend, so I can ask you offline too, and then our listeners can maybe as well. But for our purpose of the conversation today, one of the things that you know, we've been talking about is just this idea of like more things coming up, a lot of changes coming up, and I think that no matter how stable a person is working on feeling and how much work they're doing, it's hard to oftentimes like not feel overwhelmed by the world, by the different situations, by what's thrown at you, especially if you're in larger organizations. Sometimes you have less control about restructuring, less control about layoffs. You know, the decisions are a little bit more outside of your hands. And so for a leader who is perhaps feeling a bit overwhelmed today by competing priorities, but wants to create a truly people-first workplace, what would be perhaps a single most impactful component of the Thriving Talent Framework they should focus on first to ensure the change is sustainable, not just another fizzle-out initiative?
Yeah. So, I mean, the reason I put psychological safety as the foundation is because for me, that is the first step. And if the default is that we probably don't have a psychologically safe environment, I think that's the most sensible first step for people to take. And that can look like what you just said a second ago, admitting that you don't have all the answers, showing that level of vulnerability, seeking dissent when you're in meetings. It can be inviting different voices to share their opinions. And I think just creating that environment where it's okay to share what's on your mind. And I always loved the devil's advocate and playing devil's advocate when I was in meetings and just saying, well, what if this doesn't work out? Or how can we pick this apart so that we can listen to different people's opinions? So for me, that's always the best place to start. But kind of slightly tied in with that is the idea of our values and creating that positive workplace culture. So is what we say our values, is that the same as the way people experience work? So if we're, and again, I'll use a personal example here. I worked in an organization where one of the values was simple. And when I wanted to send a marketing email, this was in an organization with about 40,000 people. I wanted to send a local marketing email in Ireland to our local clients. And because I was using the branding of the organization I worked in, I had to get approval from one of two people based in a different time zone to me. And that approval was going to take, 2 weeks or something, where it would have been just far easier for me to have everyone in the team individually email their clients. It was about an event or something that was coming up. And it just, if you're saying one thing, but you're behaving, or you have systems or policies in place that say something different, that erodes the trust that we have in the leaders and in the organization as a whole. So I think kind of combining those two, so creating psychological safety through modeling those behaviors. And this is not like I'm going to show up to one meeting and create psychological safety. This is an ongoing thing, and you need to do it again and again and again. And even if you think it's not working, you need to still do it, because people are going to take a while to come over to sharing what's going on for them, especially if they're not used to doing it. But then that combined with making sure that what you say and how you behave is in line with how things are supposed to be. And you can do that by being able to call out the behaviors that you see that are, that go against what you do. Policies may be a little bit more difficult to change. I think maybe bringing this back, Sanja, to what you said, like being in a large global organization and maybe feeling a bit out of control, the beauty about that is that you can create a small culture for the team that you have. You can create psychological safety at that team level. It doesn't have to be organization wide. You can create that. And that is one of the biggest differences in team dynamics, is that different leaders create different levels of psychological safety. And so you may have differing levels within an organization based on the leaders that people have. So don't think that you need to have it organization wide. If you're an individual leader listening to this, you can create that for your own team, and you can create that micro culture of this is how we behave in this team, and this is how it lines up with the values of the organization.
Well, thank you so much for highlighting that, because it actually just made, I was actually looking at Amy Edmondson's psychological safety scale earlier today, and I believe all of the items, or nearly all of them, are team-based. And so she talks about the concept as a team. And so I think I love that you highlighted that, because from a leader standpoint, it makes you feel like you have so much more influence and such a bigger way to impact what's happening, because you would be creating that psychological safety on the team level for it to be really effective. You don't have to wait for it to be top down. So I love that advice, because it's so empowering for a person. Like, there's so many things. I think a lot of us might be feeling like, I don't want to say helpless, but there's some things that are really hard for us to control. And so I think many of us are continuing to search for those things, like, what can I control? What can I impact?
Exactly. And knowing where you can have the influence. And I think sometimes we do feel like all of these things are out of our control, but I think you can bring some things back into your control if you can do this, rather than, and this is, I suppose, related with agency as well. How much agency do I feel like I have at work? And maybe how much agency can I take back? I can create this kind of environment for my team, and that's enough for me, even if my leader is not doing that for me.
Yeah. Aoife, I can't thank you enough. Thank you for who you are, for what you stand for this wonderful book that you brought to life. It's been such a pleasure. It's always a pleasure. And so I kind of I was teasing earlier, well, I'm so glad we're friends because I can always have a conversation with you. But I know you're just such a wonderful human being and you're always collaborating with different individuals and different organizations. So for our listeners who would like to learn more about your work, get in touch with you, and also get a copy of your book, what's the best way to do all of those?
Yeah, well, the best way to get a copy of the book is thrivingtalentbook.com. So it's just all one word, thrivingtalentbook.com. And if you want to reach out to me directly, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so you can find me there. I will spell out my name because maybe if you're listening, you don't know how to spell it or you don't know how to say it. So it's spelled Aoife, Aoife. And my surname is O'Brien. So Aoife O'Brien, Aoife O'Brien. Search me on LinkedIn and I'd be happy to connect. Just let me know where you found me.
Yeah. And I would highly recommend two things. One, if you're not connected with Aoife or following her on LinkedIn, please do, because she puts just the most wonderful content out there. And do have a listen to her podcast because it is incredible. It is uplifting. You've had some wonderful guests. So the podcast is Happier at Work. So I would say if you're not ready or don't have a particular topic, you want to get in touch with Aoife today, just follow her work. And I promise you will be very glad that you did.
Thank you.
Aoife, thank you again from the bottom of my heart for your time today. It's really lovely to spend time with you. I hope the book tour is going brilliantly in the US right now. And I can't wait to talk with you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our listeners. We'll see you all again soon.